In the luxurious space of the restaurant Le Royal, the sparkling crystal chandelier reflects on the expensive Rolex watch on Richard's wrist. The elegant black suit hugs his strong body, exuding success and power. Opposite him is Victoria, his beautiful, proud wife-to-be, who is passionately talking about her lavish wedding plans. Sophie, a little girl with big round eyes and shiny blonde hair, was playing nearby and happened to see Richard. The sparkling watch and the elegant black suit caught her attention. For some reason, Sophie felt a strange urge, an indescribable sense of familiarity. "Dad!" Sophie suddenly cried out, her clear voice echoing throughout the restaurant. She ran towards Richard, her eyes sparkling. Richard stared in amazement at the strange girl approaching him. "Who are you calling Daddy?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Victoria frowned, looking annoyed. "There must be a mistake, Richard," she said, her voice contemptuous. Isabella rushed out of the kitchen, her heart pounding. Little Sophie had called Richard Daddy. Isabella ran to pull her daughter away, but then she stopped. Her eyes met Richard's, and they both froze. Time seemed to stand still. In that moment, Isabella saw it all, the shock, the disbelief, and a familiar glint in Richard's eyes. Richard did the same, looking at Isabella, recognizing the woman who had disappeared from his life so many years ago. A heavy secret hangs between them, a truth they both try to bury. "Sophie, that's not your father," Isabella said, her voice shaking, trying to hide her panic. "Come out here to me." But Sophie didn't move. She looked at Richard, then at Isabella, her eyes filled with confusion and curiosity. "Mom, why do you say that?" Sophie asked, her voice innocent. "I feel like he's my dad." The entire restaurant fell into a tense silence. All eyes turned to the three of them, waiting for an explanation. Ever since that fateful night at the Le Royal restaurant, Isabella has been living in a mess of emotions. The image of Richard, his surprised eyes, and Sophie's innocent question haunted her. Every night, when Sophie was fast asleep, Isabella would sit alone by the window, looking out at the silent night, letting sweet and painful memories flood back. Isabella and Richard met on a rainy afternoon in the university library. She, a poor student, was rushing to escape the rain when she accidentally bumped into Richard, a gentleman with a warm smile. From then on, they were like two perfect pieces, finding each other in the hustle and bustle of life. Their love blossomed like a brilliant flower, despite the difference in social status. Richard, the son of a wealthy family, was fascinated by Isabella's intelligence, strength and kindness. Isabella, on the other hand, found in Richard warmth, sincerity and true love. They had happy days, supporting each other in their studies, romantic dates, long nights talking about dreams and ambitions. Richard promised a bright future, a family, an everlasting love. And then one fine day Isabella discovered she was pregnant. She wanted to tell Richard the news as soon as she saw him, but for more than a month now, she had not been able to contact him since the graduation ceremony, or because he was too busy with the family business, so he did not contact her. Every day Isabella was always on the lookout for his messages, his calls, but the more she waited, the less she saw. Isabella decided to go to Richard's house to show him that she was pregnant, but as soon as she stepped out of the door, she suddenly saw a luxury car parked in front of her apartment. A rich, powerful and arrogant woman got out of the car. Next to her was a maid holding an umbrella for the woman. She was Eleanor. Isabella was confused and didn't understand what was about to happen. She stood in front of her and said, "Hello Isabella, I have something to tell you, are you available?" Her tone was polite and calm, but her eyes showed contempt. "Yes ma'am, how can I help you?" Isabella replied politely. "Do you know Richard?" "Yes ma'am, he is the man I love." "The person you love? Do you know what Richard is like? Are you worthy of Richard? Are you dreaming? She is not of our class. We will never accept a poor, black woman into our family. Moreover, the time she and Richard dated was actually just an act. Richard already had a fiancée. Someone worthy of him, not a poor person like her." These words made Isabella's heart clench. She couldn't believe what the strange woman had just said to her. She felt like everything was falling apart. Could he be lying to her? There were so many questions in her head right now. Isabella replied, "No way, he couldn't lie to me, he loves me very much. He even promised that after graduating, we would have a romantic wedding." "Wedding?" She laughed mockingly and said. "It won't happen, girl, forget about Richard, he's probably getting married to his fiancée now." "No, I must find Richard to ask clearly." "I don't believe it," Isabella said in a voice full of shock and trembling, tears already wet on her eyelashes. Mrs. Eleanor continued, "If you don't believe me, this is the letter he wrote to you. Read it." Isabella took the letter and read it. She read each word slowly so as not to miss any details. The letter said, "Dear Isabella, I'm sorry for deceiving you in the past, we shouldn't be together, the distance is too great for us to be together. Please forget me. Signed, Richard." After reading the letter, she felt like her legs couldn't stand anymore, she fell down and cried. At this point, Lady Eleanor had achieved her purpose, and she left, leaving Isabella to cry in pain. "Madam is really clever, if it weren't for the letter, she wouldn't have believed it," said Eleanor's servant as the two sat in the carriage on the way home. "I expected this situation," said Mrs. Eleanor. "That silly girl will never know the truth. Only this way will she leave Richard. Madam, what if the young master finds out that we went down to see Isabella and deceived her? I won't let that happen, don't worry." Just as Eleanor got home, Richard also came back from work a short while later. She called. "Richard, I have something to tell you. Isabella came to see you today." Hearing this, Richard's eyes lit up and his face was filled with excitement. "Really, Mom? How is she? Tell me." Richard urged Eleanor impatiently. "I'm sorry, she said she's going to marry another man. She's getting married. And here's Isabella's letter. Please read it." Richard was stunned. He couldn't believe his ears. Isabella, the girl he loved, the girl he had promised a bright future with, was saying she was going to marry another man? He quickly snatched the letter from his mother's hand, reading each line with a broken heart. "Dear Richard, I've thought about it carefully. We don't belong together. I feel I'm not worthy of you, my status is too different from your family's. I will marry another man, someone who can give me a stable and happy life. Forget me, Richard. I wish you all the best. Signed, Isabella." Richard collapsed into his chair, his hands shaking as he clutched the letter. He couldn't believe it, couldn't believe that Isabella would write these words. He knew how much Isabella loved him, and he loved her deeply too. Something was definitely wrong, someone had forced her. "Mother, I don't believe this is from Isabella," Richard said hoarsely. "Something must have happened. I must find her." "Son, I know you love Isabella, but you have to accept the truth," Eleanor said, her voice full of concern. "She has made her decision, and there is nothing you can do about it." "No, Mother, I can't give up," Richard said, standing up with determination. "I will find out the truth, I will prove to Isabella my love for her." Richard rushed out of the house and drove to Isabella's apartment. He hoped to find her there, to talk to her and figure things out. But when he got there, he found the apartment empty and locked. He asked the neighbors, but no one knew where Isabella had gone. Richard returned home in despair. He didn't know what to do, didn't know where to find Isabella. He felt like he was missing an important part of his life. In the following days, Richard lived in torment and anxiety. He kept calling Isabella, but no one answered. He reached out to their mutual friends, but no one had any news of her. Time passed by and 5 years passed. He had looked for Isabella many times, but there was no news. Since then, he closed his heart and did not love anyone else, although his mother was very worried about this. Around him, there was no shortage of rich and beautiful ladies. But to him, no one could compare to Isabella. The pain gradually subsided, he focused on developing his father's company, because he would be the successor of the group. At work, He always tried hard, responded flexibly, handled work very quickly and intelligently. He helped his father bring the company to a new level. Sales continued to grow. His father's partner loved him very much, and always wanted him to become his son-in-law, Mr. Macton. His youngest daughter was extremely talented, intelligent and beautiful, that was Victoria. The two families planned for Victoria and Richard to marry each other. Since the day he met Isabella again, he felt both happy and confused. He could not deny the excitement when he saw Isabella after so many years apart. Her beauty was still intact, even more charming and attractive. But what troubled him the most was little Sophie. Sophie's clear eyes and bright smile made him feel a strange connection. He couldn't explain why he felt so familiar. Was it just a coincidence, or was there some secret he didn't know? Richard decided to meet Isabella to talk. One day he went to the bar to find Isabella to ask her everything about 5 years ago, but Isabella always refused to see him. She didn't want the painful past to resurface again. But since meeting her again, Richard's heart was pounding again. He always tried to approach her. Late one night, Isabella was on her way home. She saw the shadow of a man always following her, watching her. Until she stopped and said, "Richard, is that you?" Richard stepped out of the shadows. He said, "I just want to talk to you for a moment." Isabella seemed to be confused now. She said, "Is there anything left to say between us?" Richard was surprised by Isabella's attitude. He said, "How are you these days? Is life good? Thank you for your concern. My child and I are still doing well." Richard asked in surprise, "Why mother and daughter? Didn't you say you were married? After graduation that year, you told me you were going to marry another man." Hearing this, Isabella was surprised and asked again. She said, "I have never married any other man, and I have never written to you like that. When I found out I was pregnant, and I wanted to tell you the good news, but your mother came to find me, she said, 'Forget about me, because all this time you only deceived me, you already have your fiancé.' Do you know those words were like 1,000 knives stabbing my heart? So now what are you looking for me for? Everything is over, there is nothing left between us. Leave me and my child alone." She spoke in a trembling voice, mixed with sobs, 2 lines of tears falling. Richard was stunned by Isabella's words. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. "No, Isabella, I didn't know that. My mother told me you were married and sent me a farewell letter." He took out the letter that Eleanor had given him years ago from his pocket and showed it to Isabella. "This is the letter my mother gave me. I believe that you had a change of heart." Isabella took the letter and read it line by line. She was completely surprised. "This is not my letter. I never wrote these words." Richard said, "I understand now. It turns out that everything was arranged by my mother. The purpose was to separate you and me. In the past 5 years, I have never forgotten you, your image, your smile is always in my mind. And Sophie is my daughter, right?" Isabella nodded through her tears. She said, "Yes." Richard hugged Isabella tightly, as if to fill the void of years of longing. She sobbed in his arms. Then suddenly she pushed him away. "Richard, aren't you married? Isn't the girl with you in that restaurant your wife?" "Yes, Victoria is his fiancée. She is also an arrangement between the two families. But his heart never belonged to her." With that, Richard hugged her tightly again. He said, "I want to make it up to you, I want us to get back together. My feelings for you have never faded." Isabella choked up and looked at him, filled with emotion. Her beautiful face looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. He gently placed a kiss on her lips, a passionate kiss. The storm of emotions between the two of them seemed to wash away everything. Their breathing was rapid, and they were entangled in the cold, dark night. "But my mother will never agree to let me be with you." "Don't worry, this time I won't let my mother interfere in my personal affairs anymore." Isabella smiled in relief. It was late at night and little Sophie was probably waiting for her mother to come home. Victoria was busy and happily preparing her wedding dress and invitations, but recently she found Richard very distracted, not paying attention to the wedding plans, and repeatedly breaking off appointments with her due to sudden work. Victoria began to feel uneasy. She noticed the change in Richard's eyes, the distraction in their conversations. Every time Richard looked into the distance, she felt an invisible distance growing between them. Victoria was not naive. She came from a wealthy, powerful family and was used to being in control. She knew that Richard was a talented, successful man and a great asset to her family. But she also knew that he did not love her. At first, Victoria told herself that it was just unfounded anxiety. Richard was a grown man, he wouldn't let his past affect their future. But then, the signs became clearer. Richard was often absent from their dates. He used work as an excuse, but Victoria knew he was lying. She hired someone to follow him, and learned that he frequented a small cafe on the outskirts of town. One afternoon, Victoria decided to go to that cafe. She saw Richard sitting with a woman and a little girl. The woman was Isabella, and the little girl was Sophie. Victoria felt like a knife had been stabbed into her heart. She realized that Richard still loved Isabella, and that Sophie could be his daughter. Victoria also began to change the way she treated Richard. She became more gentle and caring, trying to win his heart. She hoped that if she could make Richard fall in love with her, he would forget Isabella. But Victoria didn't know that Richard's love for Isabella was an unquenchable fire. And no matter how hard she tried, she could never replace Isabella's place in his heart. Victoria is not a woman who gives up easily. She decided to fight for her love, or at least for her position. She will not let a poor woman and an unknown child take away her man. Victoria begins to learn about Richard and Isabella's past. She learns that they were once deeply in love, but were torn apart by a secret. She decides to find out that secret, and use it against Isabella. Victoria refused to accept the fact that Richard still loved Isabella. She decided to do everything she could to keep Richard by her side, even if it meant using dark means. Victoria began to follow Isabella and Sophie. She learned about their lives, about the hardships they had gone through. She also learned about Richard and Isabella's past, about the secrets that had torn them apart. One day, Victoria went to see Eleanor, Richard's mother. She learned that Eleanor was the one who caused the separation between Richard and Isabella in the past. Victoria asked Eleanor to cooperate with her to separate Richard and Isabella again. Eleanor agreed. She did not want Richard to return to Isabella, a poor woman with a child of her own. She wanted Richard to marry Victoria, a rich and powerful woman worthy of their family. Victoria and Eleanor began to plot. They decided to use Sophie to separate Richard and Isabella. They knew that Richard loved Sophie very much, and he would do anything to protect his daughter. Victoria and Eleanor spread rumors that Sophie was the daughter of another man, not Richard. They also spread rumors that Isabella was a slut, unworthy of Richard. These rumors quickly spread, reaching Richard's ears. He was heartbroken and disappointed. He did not know who to believe, what to do. Isabella was also very sad. She knew that Victoria and Eleanor were trying to separate her and Richard. She decided to fight for her love, for her daughter's happiness. Victoria, ruthless and determined, sought out a professional photo editor who created fake photos of Isabella in a romantic relationship with an unknown man. The photos were so elaborately created that it was difficult to tell the difference between the real and the fake. After obtaining the photos, Victoria hired a stranger to secretly throw the envelope containing the photos into Richard's car. When Richard got into the car, he saw a strange envelope placed on the passenger seat. He opened the envelope, and immediately, he felt a strong punch in the chest. The photo showed Isabella kissing and caressing another man. Richard couldn't believe his eyes. He stared at the photos, trying to find some sign that they were fake, but couldn't. The details were too real, too convincing. Richard felt like the world was collapsing under his feet. He couldn't believe that Isabella, the woman he loved and trusted, could betray him so cruelly. He remembered the sweet words and passionate kisses Isabella had given him, and felt like he had been painfully betrayed. Richard's mind was in chaos. He didn't know who to believe, what to do. He wanted to believe that the photos were fake, but they were too real. He wanted to believe that Isabella still loved him, but the photos proved otherwise. Richard drove home feeling hurt and angry. He couldn't focus on anything but the photos. He felt like he was missing an important part of his life. When he got home, Richard threw the photos on the table and plopped down on the couch. He stared at the photos, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. But the more he looked, the more pain and frustration he felt. Richard decided to meet Isabella to clarify everything. He wanted to hear her explanation, wanted to know the truth behind these photos. But he was also afraid that no matter what Isabella said, he would not be able to forgive her. He drove to the coffee shop where she worked, filled with questions and doubts. When he entered the shop, he saw Isabella serving customers. She was still as beautiful and radiant as ever, but her eyes held a deep sadness. Richard walked up to Isabella and showed her the photos. Isabella looked at the photos, and she was stunned. She couldn't believe her eyes. She didn't understand why these photos were there, and why they showed her being intimate with a strange man. "Richard, I don't know where these pictures came from," Isabella said, her voice shaking. "I've never met this man, and I've never done anything like this." Richard looked at Isabella, searching for some sign that she was lying. But he couldn't. Her eyes were too sincere, too pained. "I don't know who did this," Isabella continued. "But I do know that they're trying to divide us." Richard was silent for a moment. He looked at Isabella, then at the photos. He didn't know who to trust, what to do. "I want to believe you, Isabella," Richard said. "But these pictures are too real. I can't understand." "I understand," said Isabella. "I know you're hurting. But please, believe me. I would never lie to you." Richard looked at Isabella, and he saw the sincerity in her eyes. He knew she was telling the truth. But he still had doubts. He needed more time to think. "I need time," Richard said. "I need time to figure things out." Richard left the cafe, his mind filled with conflicting thoughts. He didn't know what to do, who to trust. All he knew was that he was in pain. Meanwhile, Victoria was watching Richard and Isabella from afar. She smiled, pleased with her plan. She knew that the photos had sown doubt in Richard's mind, and that he would never trust Isabella again. Victoria believed that she had won. She believed that Richard would come back to her, and they would have a happy life together. But she did not know that Richard's love for Isabella was stronger than any plot. Richard had no idea that the person behind those photos was Victoria. One time, when he and Victoria went to a restaurant, she accidentally left her phone on the table. A message popped up on the phone screen. He accidentally glanced at it and saw that the message mentioned Isabella's name. At this time, he picked up the phone and read all the messages from an unknown number. He began to suspect that Victoria was related to the photos. He quickly put the phone down on the table, before Victoria returned. He tried to act normal, not giving any sign that he knew the secret. But in his mind, a series of questions and speculations began to appear. He decided to act more covertly. He hired a private investigator to follow Victoria, recording her every move and conversation. One afternoon, the detective reports that Victoria met a strange man at a deserted coffee shop. Richard asks the detective to record their conversation and videotape the two of them. Richard was stunned when he heard the recording again. Victoria and the stranger were discussing a plan to break up Richard and Isabella. They mentioned the fake photos, and Victoria snickered at the fact that Richard had believed them. "He was stupid enough to believe those pictures," Victoria said. "He never knew the truth." The strange man asked, "What about Isabella? Does she suspect anything?" Victoria replied, "No, she was too naive. She never thought I could do this." Richard felt like his heart was on fire when he heard this. He couldn't believe that Victoria, the woman he was about to marry, could be so cruel and evil. He felt like he had been blatantly deceived. Richard decided to confront Victoria. But he didn't want to make a scene. He wanted to expose her secretly, so she would suffer shame and humiliation. Richard planned a romantic evening. He invited Victoria to a fancy restaurant where they had many fond memories. Throughout the dinner, Richard was attentive and gentle, making Victoria feel at ease. As dinner ended, Richard told Victoria that he had a special gift for her. He gave her a USB, saying that it contained their souvenir photos. Victoria plugged the USB into her laptop and opened the folder. She saw familiar pictures, and she smiled. But then, she saw an audio file. She opened the audio file, and she heard her voice. Victoria paled when she heard her conversation with the strange man. She looked at Richard, and she saw his cold eyes. She didn't understand how Richard knew about this. "Can you explain this?" Richard asked, his voice cold. Victoria was silent, and she began to cry. Richard stood up and left the restaurant. As Richard turned to leave, Victoria was almost in despair. She rushed forward and grabbed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Richard, please, don't leave me," Victoria sobbed, her voice pleading. "I know I was wrong, I did unforgivable things. But I did it all because I loved you so much. I couldn't bear to see you belong to someone else." Richard stopped, but he did not turn to look at Victoria. His face remained cold and emotionless. "I love you, Richard," Victoria continued, her voice choking. "I fell in love with you at first sight. I couldn't live without you. I would do anything to keep you by my side." Victoria knelt down and hugged Richard's legs. "Please, forgive me. I promise I will never do it again. I will do anything to make it up to you." Richard looked down at Victoria, his eyes filled with disappointment. "You've gone too far, Victoria," he said, his voice hoarse. "You've not only lied to me, you've tried to ruin someone else's happiness. You're no longer the girl I knew." "No, Richard, I'm still me," Victoria sobbed. "I'm just so scared of losing you. I've lost control. Please, give me another chance." Richard was silent for a moment. He looked at Victoria, and he saw the pain in her eyes. But he also saw her selfishness and cruelty. "I can't forgive you, Victoria," Richard said, his voice firm. "I can't trust you anymore. I need an honest and trustworthy woman who will love me unconditionally." Victoria bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. She knew she had lost Richard forever. "I'm sorry, Richard," Victoria said, her voice weak. "I'm sorry for everything." Richard removed Victoria's hand from his leg and turned to walk away. He didn't look back. He knew that no matter what Victoria said, he couldn't go back to her. Victoria looked at Richard, tears streaming down her face. She knew that she had lost the man she loved the most. She had lost everything because of her selfishness and jealousy. Immediately after leaving the restaurant, he drove to see Isabella, but when he arrived, the apartment was empty and the door was locked. He rushed to the restaurant where Isabella worked, but the staff there said that she had quit her job. Richard began to feel extremely worried. He called Isabella, but no one answered. He called her friends and relatives, but no one had any news. He suspected something was wrong. At this point, Richard felt like he was losing control. He didn't know what to do, where to find Isabella. He felt helpless and scared. Suddenly, an unfamiliar number popped up on his phone screen. Richard picked it up, his voice filled with worry. "Hello?" On the other end of the line was Isabella, her voice urgent and distressed. "Richard, please save Sophie." Isabella sobbed, her voice nearly breaking. "I haven't found her in over a day." Richard panicked, his heart almost stopped. "Calm down, Isabella. Tell me where you are. I'll be there soon." I don't know," Isabella choked out. "I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find her. They took her." "Them? Who kidnapped Sophie?" Richard growled, concern turning to anger. "I don't know, Richard," Isabella sobbed. "They called me from an unknown number, threatening me. They said if I didn't leave town, they would hurt Sophie." Richard gripped the phone tightly, his hand shaking. "Isabella, you have to trust me. We will find her together. Tell me where you are." I'm at. Isabella hesitated, then she gave the address. I'll be there, Richard said, hanging up the phone and rushing out of the house. He sped off, worried and scared. He couldn't imagine what was happening to his little girl, Sophie. When he arrived, Richard found Isabella sitting huddled on the steps, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. He rushed to hug her. "Isabella, I'm here," Richard said, his voice shaking. "We'll find Sophie. I promise." Isabella hugged Richard tightly, sobbing. "I'm scared, Richard. I'm scared I'm going to lose her." "We will not lose her," Richard said, his voice firm. "We will find her, whatever it takes." Richard and Isabella came up with a plan to find Sophie. They decided to call the police, but they also knew they couldn't wait. They had to act immediately. After 2 days of intense investigation, the police found Sophie. She was placed in the care of a nanny, and fortunately, Sophie was completely safe. Richard and Isabella breathed a sigh of relief, but they still could not understand why their daughter had been kidnapped. As the police continued to investigate, they discovered a horrifying truth: the person behind Sophie's kidnapping was none other than Richard's mother, Eleanor. Richard took Isabella and Sophie to a luxurious hotel, booking them a cozy suite. He wanted to make sure they were safe and comfortable after what they had been through. "You two stay here and rest, don't worry. I'll be back soon," he said, kissing Isabella's forehead and looking at Sophie affectionately. After making sure that mother and son were settled, Richard rushed home. Anger boiled inside him. He couldn't believe that the mother he loved could do such a cruel thing. When he got home, he found his mother sitting in the living room, her face still cold and arrogant. "What have you done?" Richard roared, his voice shaking with rage. "You kidnapped my daughter Sophie." Eleanor showed no remorse. "I did it because I didn't want her to bring shame on our family," she said, her voice contemptuous. "She doesn't deserve you, Richard." "You were wrong," Richard shouted, his anger rising. "Sophie is my daughter, and Isabella is the woman I love. You have no right to dictate my happiness." "You don't understand, Richard," Eleanor said, her voice still cold. "I only want what's best for you. Isabella and that girl will only bring you trouble." "You ruined my life," Richard screamed, tears welling up in his eyes. "You separated me from Isabella, and now you want to separate me from your daughter. Do you know how much pain I've caused?" Eleanor was silent, unable to look her son in the eye. I just wanted to protect you," she said, her voice fading. "Protect me?" Richard sneered. "By destroying my happiness? I am no longer the mother you loved." Richard turned away, not wanting to see the woman who had been his everything. "I will never forgive you," he said, his voice filled with hatred. Richard returned to the hotel and found Isabella and Sophie sleeping soundly on the bed. He sat down beside the bed and looked at them, feeling a warm feeling in his heart. He felt so lucky to have them by his side. Richard decided that he would not let his mother interfere in his life anymore. He would protect Isabella and Sophie. He would give them a happy life. The next morning, Richard took Isabella and Sophie to a luxurious villa on the outskirts of the city. He wanted to give them a home, a place where they could live happily and peacefully. Isabella and Sophie were very happy. They felt like they were living in a dream. After so many events, they finally found happiness. Richard and Isabella had a cozy wedding at the mansion. They invited close friends and family to attend. Sophie was the little bridesmaid. She was very happy to see her parents get married. On the wedding day, Mrs. Eleanor went to see Richard. She wanted to apologize to her son, wanted to make peace with her son and daughter-in-law. "Richard, I'm sorry," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have interfered in your life. I shouldn't have separated you and Isabella." Richard looked at his mother. He saw the regret in her eyes. He knew that his mother had changed. "Mother, I forgive you," Richard said, hugging his mother. "I wish you would accept Isabella and Sophie." Mrs. Eleanor nodded. She hugged her son and daughter-in-law and cried. She felt so lucky to have a happy family. And so, after many ups and downs, Richard and Isabella found their happy ending. Together they built a warm family, where love and forgiveness always reigned. Old secrets were revealed, misunderstandings were resolved, and hearts were healed. In the luxurious villa, the laughter of children echoed everywhere, dispelling the gloom of the past. Richard and Isabella looked at each other, their eyes filled with love and gratitude. They knew that no matter how difficult life was, as long as they had each other, they would overcome it all. After realizing her mistake, Eleanor became a kind and loving grandmother. She devoted all her time to taking care of her grandchildren, making up for her past mistakes. She understood that her children's happiness was her own happiness. Victoria, after losing Richard, learned the lesson of letting go. She found joy in her work and friendships. She understood that love cannot be forced, and happiness cannot be built on lies. Richard and Isabella's story is a testament to the power of love and forgiveness. They show that no matter how painful the past may be, as long as we have faith and hope, we can still find happiness in the present and the future. And so their lives continued to flow, peaceful and happy, like a calm song after a storm. They wrote a beautiful love story, a story of forgiveness and healing, a story that will forever be told as a testament to the power of true love. Thank you for listening to the story. If you find this story interesting, touching your heart, do not hesitate to leave a comment below, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss any of our videos. See you in the next video.